This is Platform Diaries with Shane Williams, who chews the fat with entrepreneurs, startup founders and thought leaders on what it takes to traverse the wall between startup and scale-up.
It's not uncommon for founders and the founding team to assume that they'll be on the entire journey all the way to unicorn. But the reality is that's not necessarily the case. So how do we go about transforming our team from startup to scale-up? You're listening to Platform Diaries, and I'm your host, Shane Williams. My guest today is Steve Grace, founder of the Nudge Group, CEO at Balance the Grind, host of the Give It a Nudge podcast, a director at YBF Ventures, and an Antler Angel. Steve deeply appreciates the reality that your founding team aren't necessarily going to be on the entire journey, and shares his lessons from the 3 businesses that he's founded about how to successfully navigate the team transformation from startup to scale-up. I hope you enjoy the interview. So Steve, thanks for joining me on Platform Diaries.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Now, we were chatting a week or so ago, just before I'd had our Melbourne Scale-Up Leaders event, and I was kind of leaning into the topic, what are we going to talk about? What's going to be the main theme for the event? And we were talking about this journey from startup to scale-up. And I think you and I were having the conversation around people and teams and leadership and whatnot. And you used a term I hadn't heard used in the scale-up space before, which was transformation, which kind of got me thinking. And it got me thinking because I always imagine the transformation piece is when you're trying to leap from scale-up to unicorn. It's this bigger thing where there's a lot more at stake and a lot harder to do. I'd never not necessarily put the term transformation into that early stage between startup and scale-up. And it wasn't until you'd said it that I went, oh, hang on, you're absolutely right. There's something in this. So I guess what I'm really interested in is, I think a lot of people who join a startup in the early days, there's kind of this assumption that we're the core team, we're the early founders, and we're going to go on this journey together. But as the team grows, is that necessarily the case? And this idea of transforming into a scale-up might not be accurate. So I suppose my question is, what do you mean when I say transforming the team? What does that mean for you?
Okay, well, first up, transformation is a terrifying word for most startups because they're like, how can we transform? We haven't even built anything yet. And I hope I gave you some content for your scale-up event, by the way.
You did, thank you.
But yeah, transforming is very much the word. I think there's this misconception. I had it probably with my first business as well. And it's rife right now, and there's lots of problems around that. And I think we'll touch on ESOPs and things like that later. But the team that you have at the beginning are probably not going to be the team that you have at the end. Now, there'll be some, but they will be few and far between. And you'll lose some of them at this phase, from that startup to scale-up phase. And then you're right, you'll lose even more at scale-up to unicorn. And that's just the reality of the world. For me, it's a different kind of individual who can come in when you're going into the scale-up phase than the kind of individual you hire at startup. At startup, we've talked about this a few times, the ambiguity, the chaos, the mayhem, the willing to do anything, the being creative, the ability to switch from task to task to task to task. That's the key, right? Now, you put that person in an environment where you're scaling up and every role has become specific and there needs focus and you need to not get distracted and you need to rely on other people to do things. They're completely different personalities. So yes, some people can exist in both those worlds, but not many people can exist in both those worlds well. And I think most founders just automatically assume the first 10, maybe 20 employees, certainly the first 10, they want them with them forever. And they see these guys at the end and that's how they sell it to them and they tell them they're going to be there forever. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But the reality is they're probably not. And I don't think enough people plan and think about that as they go through this journey of startup to scale up, which is arguably, when does that happen anyway, is a question I get asked a lot. But does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And funnily enough, that's exactly the next question I was thinking of. But I think, in summary, I suppose it's the team who are really good at creating something aren't necessarily the team that are really good at running and scaling something. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Just everyone talks about how founders need to get out of the way of their own business at some point. And not all founders do, but a lot of founders do. And they need to have other people come in and run and grow the business whilst they take a slightly different role, whether that be an evangelism role, a chairman role, a head of product role, or whatever it is that whatever background they've come from. But no one talks about the founding team in the same way. And it's exactly the same thing. And you're right, a founding team, just like a founder, most will need to get out the way of the business at some point. And it's a horrible scenario if you haven't planned for it and you've never talked about it. As a founder, when you realize that out of your 6 original people or 5 original, 10 or whatever that number is, 4 of them have either got to go or you've got to find something else for them to do. And yet they've given you everything to get you where they are, and you feel indebted to them. And now you're in a situation where you know to take the business to the next level, you've either got to remove them or you've got to try and find something else for them to do that's useful. It's not a comfortable place for any founder to be.
It's interesting you say that, Steve. One of the co-facilitators at the most recent Scale Up Leaders Network event that we ran is Mary Butler, who's well known around the space in Scale Up Leadership, and her new book that's coming out, which is exactly around the founder's journey and getting out of your way as a founder to help enable the business. And I'm not doing the book justice. It's a brilliant book, and definitely go and seek it out. But the reason for bringing it up is exactly that point. It's not just the founding team, but the founder and all that group. If you're great at starting and building something, are you ready or the right person to take it forward? And I think that could be really daunting for a founder. Hey, this is my baby. I built this. It's my idea. How do I let go? So then I will lead into that next question where I was going to take it, which is, when does this, in the life cycle of the business, when do you know it's about to become a problem? When does it become a problem? And what's the impact of it happening?
I think it's different for each one. So like I said, that question I get asked more than anything. If ever I do a Q&A, and I've started to do more Q&As because it takes a lot less preparation than having to do keynotes, right? So if anyone wants to talk to me, please, let's do a Q&A. But if ever I do a Q&A, question I always get asked is, what is the definition of a scale-up? When does a startup become a scale-up? And I think it varies from business to business. I have 2 definitions in my head, neither of which I'm sure are right, but they're my definitions. So Steve Grace's definitions of when a startup becomes a scale-up are, I think, for me, when you no longer have a limited runway. So this is more driven by funding than anything else. And I've got another one that's more driven by product. But most startups are trying to give away as little equity as possible. So they're trying to raise as minimum as they need to get their valuation up and so forth. Everyone knows the journey there. And they'll have a runway. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 12, maybe it's 2 years. I think when you get to a point where the raise was big enough, whether that be 20 million or 100 million, big enough that the runway no longer counts because you started to generate quite a lot of revenue, and really that money is not to keep you alive, it's to just accelerate your growth. That to me is when a startup becomes a scale up from a funding perspective. I think from a product perspective, I think it's when you make that journey from MVP to grown up. So, you've got the product, people want it, people are beginning to buy it. You've spent a little bit of time working with your customers to develop what that product needs to look like for them. So you've gone beyond what you thought it was, and now you're in a space where you're building it based on what your customers in the market wants. And I think that's also the same time. And they usually occur around the same time. To me, that's startup to scale up. And that's when everyone's roles need to become a little bit more specific.
It's interesting. Mary and I had this discussion too. And what we lent towards was the sort of OECD description of a growth business. And it was, I think it was more than 10 people and 3 back-to-back years of 20% year-on-year growth. And that was the growth definition, if you like, for a growth business, or the definition for a growth business. And I think we kind of landed in that kind of makes sense. If your business is growing 20% year-on-year, you're probably going to start to feel, you must have proved a product, because if you're growing that much, then someone's buying it. And if you're growing 20% year on year, you must be putting more humans into your business, most likely, and therefore probably starting to feel some of the pinch of, hey, we've got new folks, we've got old folks, we've got people who have, now in defined roles, that sort of stuff like you just described.
Yeah. 10 people is an interesting number, isn't it? People always say 10. I think 10's low, but that's, it seems to be the agreed number.
Yeah, maybe is it a 10 is the minimum as opposed to it's definitely not a maximum. But if you've got less than 10, you wouldn't be a scale up, I suppose.
Yeah, you got to have double figures. Is that it? I don't know. If you go to any of these, and we were just talking about some of these scale up hubs, they always have minimum 10-person offices. So I don't know. It just seems to be somewhere. Maybe it was Mary. Someone has made this definition of 10, and everyone's just running with it. But I think it varies.
Fair enough. So then, what do you see the impacts of that? I mean, we've talked about the founders and this kind of realization that maybe you need to get out of the way, what other issues do you get at that scale?
So I think startup to scale up, the founders probably don't need to get out of the way. I think that founder problem comes far later. I think that's when you're going from scale up to some significant growth, whether that be global or whether that be IPO or trade sale or whatever it might be. I think at this stage, I mean, for example, you probably got one person in product, you probably got one or two people in sales, one in marketing, maybe two, so they're doing multiple things. As soon as you get to that phase where everything's proven, everything works, we want to scale, we've got the money, let's go, you need to suddenly go, okay, well, we need someone who can just focus on our social strategy from a marketing point of view, and someone who's just going to focus on PR from a marketing point of view, someone who's just going to focus on comms. Same with technology. You're going to have, okay, well, we need someone now who's going to work really closely with the product guys, someone who's going to just build, someone who's going to look at the UX. We're going to have a front-end person as well as a back-end person. We're not looking at a developer there. With sales, we're going to have someone maybe on enterprise or someone on SME or someone on a different region. You're beginning to split those roles out. Now, the people that you get at the beginning, the wonderful thing about them and why you've succeeded is their ability to do all of those things at the same time. If you get one of those people in at the early stage and they can only do one thing, then they really inhibit your growth. So when you get someone who's good at that, and that's their natural way, to then say to them, actually, I'm going to cut your role in three, and you're just going to focus on that, more often than not, they get bored, they get frustrated, or even worse, and this is what usually happens, they start to stick their fingers in everyone else's business. And then the new people that you've hired specifically who are at that more scale-up space get really annoyed and say, this guy's driving me nuts. I can't do anything. He's all over me. He's trying to take my business. He's trying to do this. He's trying to do that. And marketing people and PR people start arguing. And you end up with, I guess, frustrations from the new people coming in who've been brought in to do a very specific thing, claiming that they can't achieve that because the old person who thinks they've got more kudos because they've been there the longer time still have control over that. And this is where it can get really, really awful for a founder. And usually when that realization comes that, oh my gosh, what am I going to do here? If this person can't stop doing this, I'm going to have to get rid of them. How can I get rid of them? They brought me on this journey. And you go into this horrible spin. And if you keep those people, it will affect the people that you hire and they'll often leave, meaning that you're inhibiting your growth. And if you get rid of them, well, you've got to work out how you're going to do that. Or if you move them into a different role, how do you do that? It's a really difficult and stressful time for a founder that should not be focusing on this at this time.
That's a fair statement. So then conversely, if you've done it well, I think you kind of hinted at some of the things there just then, but if you've done it well, what does that look like? Who's done it well and how?
Who's done it well? Look, I think having conversations with those staff at the very early days, so before you quite reach that scale up, as you're having success, it's starting to have regular quarterly catch-ups. This is what I believe. With these key members of staff saying, this is where we're heading. Where do you see yourself fitting in? So you're kind of giving them the option of going, okay, your role's not going to be able to remain like this. So where do you want it to go? Because we're going to need to build this. We're going to need to build this. We're going to need to build this. You're probably not right to head that up. Where else could we do? What other things interest you? How can you see this going? And if they don't, and some people are self-aware, there's quite a lot of people in the market who consider themselves startup specialists, then you can plan their route out to something else or even a new product, or there's all sorts of options there. But I think the people who do it well are the people who have the conversations before they need to, rather than waiting for the breakdown like I just spoke about earlier and then dealing with it. It's like everything in any kind of business. Communication is the key. But it's also being very blunt and upfront about where the future of the business is going and the timelines and how are they going to fit into that, giving them an opportunity to come up with something. And sometimes they'll realize they can't. And that's great because it takes you out of the equation of being in that difficult situation and you can plan it really well. But if they do come up with options, they might come up with things that you've never thought about that you can't implement later because they've already caused so much damage. It's almost impossible to try and repair that damage with your new staff members that you've already hired.
That's an interesting one. If you think about the journey of, as you described, the single sales person, I wonder whether having that conversation earlier would also set them up to be thinking about, I need to put something in place that's not solely reliant on me. if you catch my drift. As in, I'm thinking about this more broadly, as in if someone have to hand this over, how would it work? Or is it just only work because it's me?
People surprise you, I think, when you give them the opportunity. And they might present you with, well, I've always thought we could create this side product. I'd like to go and do some research on that. I always thought we should launch into Singapore. I'd like to go and do that. Or I've always wanted to build a customer success function, which we don't have yet. What about if I get, people will surprise you. And I think you never know what people are thinking. It's usually not what you're thinking. That's what I've learned.
Yeah, fair enough.
Maybe that's a me thing.
So then we talk about doing it well means, having an open dialogue, talking about it earlier rather than waiting till the time it needs to happen, but, kind of being on the front foot. Have you seen people do the opposite and not have the conversation, and other mistakes have they made? I see it all the time. It's probably one of the most common things I see. And it becomes super difficult. And I think the biggest mistake I see is that they favour their early stage employees, like we spoke about at the very beginning, because they feel indebted. And this is detrimental to the business. And it makes it almost impossible to attract the right staff in to enable that growth to happen. So I'll give you an example without any names, of course, to protect the innocent. But there was a founder who had, for all intensive purposes, an ops guy who called himself the COO, who was really her second or third employee. And as the business started to reach to 20 people, more and more things were being taken away from him. He was looking after finance. He was looking after what the chief of staff role was doing. He was looking after what the HR person was doing. And as those roles came in, his role was diminishing, and he didn't like that one bit. So he started and I don't think it was out of any sort of spite, but he started to manipulate situations to almost prove that he was better than them to try and get those things back in. The irony is it's usually the founder who wants to ring fence everything and has trouble letting go. This founder had no problem with that at all, which was awesome. But she had a COO who wasn't a COO, who felt like everyone should report into him. And he started to create really poor environments by talking to people in whispers and this kind of stuff to protect his own territory. And it was a very difficult situation because the founder felt very indebted to that person because they'd done everything for them in the really early years. But it had gotten to such a point now where there was probably 5 or 6 people in the business that wanted this guy out because they saw him as a poison within the business. And the founder didn't want to get him out, but there was no way of recovering it. There were too many staff that had come in. The biggest mistake they then made was they hired someone. They didn't want to deal with it either, the founder. So they hired someone else in between the founder and that person, which was a complete disaster. And we're just working through the end of that now, actually. So that's the founder trying to do the right thing. And it's a person who loved doing everything, not liking the fact that the business was growing. And it's probably caused a good 8 months of really bad turmoil during a period of very high growth. And it's causing problems with customers and all sorts because they're not achieving what they need to be achieving in terms of the deliverables. So look, we're going to get through it. We're going to pop out the other side, but that's been a disaster. So that's probably the worst example I've seen of undermining other employees. And that person is not a nasty person in any way. I think they've just felt very threatened. Yeah, that's fair enough. So I think the lesson there, early conversations about where's the business going, then having the difficult conversation and not avoiding it with, hey, now's the time, we need to do something different.
And I think also having a very early conversation, if you say to someone that they're not going to be right as the time goes on. And, it's pretty obvious the people that are very good in the really super early stages are not usually very good when you hit that phase, unless you find something else completely different for them to do. And I have seen people move people into roles that you would never have dreamt of, and they've absolutely excelled in them. So it's just making sure you're going, look, I don't know how you're going to fit into this business. I honestly don't see you being able to do this, this, and this, and this. What are we going to do? And it's a brutal conversation, but the earlier you have it, the easier it is, I think.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think there's something you mentioned earlier, which in the very first question you mentioned share ownership. And I reckon that would be a really interesting one to dive into. But we're out of time. I'm going to be really cheeky. Could I get you back for the next episode and we can dive into that topic?
Absolutely.
Right. Awesome. Mate, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. And we will chat again in a fortnight.
Fantastic. See you then.
You've been listening to Platform Diaries with Shane Williams. To find out about how Shane enables digital businesses to scale, please visit shanewilliams.com.au. Thank you for listening.